From Samueli Institute headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, this is On Human Flourishing. I'm Dr. Wayne Jonas. My guest today is Dr. Geoffrey Ling. Dr. Geoffrey Ling is the founding director of the Biology Technologies Office at the Defense Advanced Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. Since he began his service at DARPA in 2004, Dr. Ling created and managed a broad research portfolio spanning neuroscience, infectious disease, pharmacology, and battlefield medicine. Dr. Ling served as an officer in the U.S. Army for more than 25 years before retiring as a colonel in 2012. His service included multiple deployments to the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. He is considered the U.S. Army's premier expert on traumatic brain injury, or TBI. His Preventing Violent Explosive Neurotrauma program developed a new understanding and treatment approaches of blast-induced TBI, and his Revolutionizing Prosthetics program developed advanced arm prostheses controlled directly by a user's brain. He is a humanitarian and a true pioneer in the field of neuroscience and bionics, and he joins us today to discuss the future of healing, technology, and public health. How did you get into these areas? What was your drivers here?
So, I always wanted to be a scientist. I mean, that was my dream, was to be a scientist. And when I went through undergraduate, my express goal was actually to become a scientist, and so that's why I went and got a PhD first. And I was there that doing research in the field of opioids. At that time, these are derivatives of morphine and Demerol and that sort of thing. But what was exciting at that time was actually looking at the fundamental science that underlied it, and it was looking at brain science in its very early phase. And you got to remember, we're talking about in the late 70s, early 80s when I started down this road, and it was very exciting. But I realized there was a disconnect. That it was very exciting to do that fundamental science, but the disconnect was not really paying as much connectivity with the research to the clinic. You know, we were working in isolation, we were looking at receptors and on it goes, but the reality is that there was a disconnect from how does this actually impact patients, because ultimately you want to improve the human condition. I very much admire pure scientists, those who study butterflies and this sort of thing. I think that we need more of that. But the reality is when you enter into a field where you're doing medically related science, studying physiology, studying pathology, studying pharmacology at that time, looking at opiates, for example, painkillers, you say, geez, where's the connection back to the patient? How can we improve the human condition? And even to this day, the very best pain relievers that we have still are derivatives of morphine. And doggone it, they had tincture of Loudon back in the Civil War. So, we really need to reconnect with the patient. So that's in fact where my career took a little bit of a divergence. So I actually, did the PhD and I did a postdoctoral fellowship and all that kind of good stuff. And then at that point I said, I've got to go into medicine and I got to try to make that connectivity. And I went into medicine. And by happenstance, life is full of these funny little twists and turns. I didn't have enough money to go to school, so I needed a rich uncle. So Uncle Sam stepped up to the plate, and so I joined the Army. And that,
same for me.
Yeah, exactly. But it was probably one of those seminal events. I mean, here we were young kids and had no idea what that meant, but we just needed the scholarship money. Figured out we put our time in and then get out, and that was not true. The joining the military culture really kind of, how should I say, augmented my feelings about connectivity back to the patient, because the military is all about the service member. It is all about the service member. Yes, we have to do the mission. Yes, we have to do the job. But at the end of the day, it's the service member that really executes that mission. And the importance of taking care of one's troops, taking care of one's colleague, taking care of one's comrade is so ingrained in the culture of the military that it comes back to almost the thing that I was saying about is where's the connectivity back to the patient. So basically it became a full loop and it was great. So when I finished all my clinical training and then I went back to being my first love, which is being a scientist, the military was fantastic. They just said, what kind of things do you want to work on that brings this kind of together, this whole idea. And I said, well, the area of brain injury was, I thought, and this was in the mid-'90s, so it hadn't become popular at all.
Right.
And so in the mid-'90s, I started getting involved in this because I felt that this is part and parcel of military service, and what do you know? But it still came back to this whole idea of taking care of the service member, and this is something that I didn't invent. This is something that I was lucky enough to benefit from. This concept that just is pervasive from the 5-star of the 5-star generals, 4-star generals, which is the highest rank down, all the way down to the lowliest private. And sergeants, believe in it. Junior officers believe in it. Everybody does. It's a great thing.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So you started down at the microreceptor area, went into the human connectivity, first through patients, saw that reinforced in the military, in the social sort of values that are embedded in that, and then got back to the science, really looking at how the brain functions and what happens when it's injured and how does it get optimized in terms of its function.
I'll add one thing too, is that the nice thing about the military is that money doesn't come into it. It's really kind of interesting. Sadly, parts of medicine, I totally understand this. People have to make a living. I get that. So a lot of my colleagues in medical school, I went to a civilian medical school. I went to Georgetown, which is a great school. I loved it there. A number of my friends who went into that realized that when they got out and done, they wanted to practice medicine, but they started to make a living. That's not true in the military. I mean, everybody gets paid by the military, and so you can just zero in on the patient, which is really kind of a neat thing, right? Mm-hmm. And there also, because you don't have to build a practice and you don't have to sustain the enterprise exists, it allows us the opportunity to actually try new things, different things. And if they succeed, great. If they don't succeed, as long as you did it properly, it really is an environment where we can actually try to do things that can actually improve the process, as it were, without having to worry about the bottom line. And that's not a little thing in these days. It's just not.
Right, yeah. And also learn from it as you go about it, instead of saying, well, if it's not going to support the bottom line, then we're not even going to do it in those areas. Yeah. I found the same thing when I practiced. I thought about getting out around 10 years in, and I saw so much of the financial drivers saying, you've got to do this, you got to do that. And I said, no, I just want to take care of the patients in those areas. So then how your work in brain injury, tell us a little bit about that, and how did that get you into some of the work that you've been doing for the last decade in DARPA?
So we started so back in '95, when I finally finished all of my training, which was forever, I basically at that point, when so I finished my training at Johns Hopkins, and I was brought back into the service because I still owed time, and this was fine. And I created pretty much an academic career as if I wasn't in the military. The only difference was I wore a uniform. So I had a lab, I had a clinical practice, and on it goes. But it was zeroed in on this brain injury thing. And we were not at war then, of course.
Right.
But I felt that it was important, and fortunately, the folks in the DoD kind of let me do what I wanted to do, even though they didn't exactly see the importance of it either. But they did recognize that, obviously, if we went back into a war environment, that brain injury is, of course, going to be important. So I got a chance to start that kind of line of investigation. Along those lines, you always you always get exposed to mentors. And I had a couple of mentors, but one in particular was a colonel, and he was at the time at U.S. Army Medical Research and Material Command, Colonel Bill Weisman. And the thing that was amazing about Colonel Weisman is that he was a nephrologist by training, trained at the NIH, went to Washington University in St. Louis Medical School. I mean, he was top drawer all the way.
Nephrologist, a kidney doctor.
A kidney doctor.
Yeah, okay.
And he came in right during Vietnam War, one of those Barry Plan kind of guys. And here he was now a senior colonel, of course, because now we're talking in the mid '90s, right? And he's a senior colonel, and the thing that was great about Colonel Weisman is that he actually opened my eyes to something. He said, look, he was very patient-focused, always been patient-focused, and very pragmatic. He says, you can do research, but in the end, the place that we must do more research is in this translational medicine. Now, remember, this is the mid-'90s. I mean, translational medicine wasn't
even a word.
Wasn't even really a word.
Then, yeah.
Exactly.
Just getting
started.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And here it was in the military, a colonel, nephrologist. That was his thought. And he headed, at that time, about that time, he was given leadership of combat casualty care research, a nephrologist, kidney guy. Combat casualty care research up at United States Army Medical Surgical Material Command. And he kind of brought me into this new concept of how do you do work so that it translates itself into very practical outcomes as soon as you can. And then you allow the interesting science to kind of follow along. And he brought up and I think about it, aspirin is a classic example of that. Aspirin was discovered long time ago, but its use for myocardial infarction was actually done by Dr. Carr back in Southern California at the turn of the century, and he actually published his work in the Mississippi Journal of Medicine. Mississippi Journal of Medicine, for goodness sakes, right? But his finding of using aspirin to prevent myocardial infarction, he didn't understand the science. It was an observation he saw that his patients after some certain ear, nose, and throat procedures had increased bleeding, and he made that connection that it had anti-clotting effects and thereby could prevent cardiothrombosis. Right. It was picked up subsequently by the Veterans Administration, who did the famous Lewis run a VA cooperative study that showed secondary prevention and blah, blah, blah. And next thing you know, aspirin is used widely. Right. But yet still nobody to this day understands the science. The science is now catching up. But at the same time, millions upon, if not billions of patients have benefited from it, as opposed to the reverse. We're going to sit there and go over this and go over this and go over this. All the while, patients are still suffering. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be a happy medium. And Weissman taught me a lot of the thinking that goes behind this. This was the coolest thing. So then he said, look, find an area of this traumatic brain injury that you think really needs work on, in addition to the basic science. We were doing basic fundamental science, receptor work and all that. And as a clinician, I was thinking, diagnosis. Diagnosis, that's a toughie, right? Diagnosis is really kind of hard to do. MRIs, CT scans are big, clunky machines. You really can't bring them out in the field, blah, blah, blah. So Weissman actually introduced me to an engineer, and he said, look, there's a new way, potentially, of diagnosing this, and using basically the same kind of technologies that's in the cell phone. Now, cell phones, of course, are really teeny tiny today. Back in 1990s, we all remember they looked like a John bag phone, but that's okay. They were actually more powerful then. I didn't even know that. They actually had much more power than, because they could, right? But so we actually looked at it. We found that we could actually do some rudimentary imaging using that basic technology, a radar technology with a couple of cell phones and so on and so forth. That was really, really interesting, because then we were able to push that forward to starting to develop early diagnostic platform from it. And then that got the eye of DARPA.
I see.
And that's how I ended up going down the path to DARPA.
I see.
When I started looking at how to put technology into medicine.
Right.
And so it was at that moment that I went from being a receptor rat guy and a doctor to where it came together with building on technology and then using it for patient care.
Right. I love your example of aspirin, because now we know there are actually multiple mechanisms underlying aspirin's effect in cardiovascular and other conditions. It doesn't work just by one mechanism, so had we only identified a mechanism, it might have not gotten into use either as widely as it is. So the mechanism research really in many ways followed the application. And so you were looking at sort of the application of technology in the area of brain injury, brain function as you moved into DARPA in those areas.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? So since then, unfortunately, brain injury has become, some say, the signature, condition of the current wars that we've been going through and have gone through, and gets manifest in multiple ways, from psychological function like PTSD and depression to cognitive issues and this type of thing. Talk a little bit about then how this was picked up. Was this sort of one of the main foci in DARPA for looking at the technology biology interface?
So it wasn't when I went there. Of course, when I joined DARPA, it was right after I returned from Afghanistan, my first deployment to Afghanistan, which was in 2003. So I joined DARPA in 2004. And at that time, TBI was just starting to become identified as a prominent problem.
Right.
Now, traumatic brain injury, TBI has been around since the advent of man. I mean, seriously, we talk about it as though it was a new condition. It's probably one of the oldest conditions. As long as people could fall down, they would, or get hit over the head or any of these other things, there was and is still traumatic brain injury. And I would argue that it has always been prevalent. It's just that we didn't know it. And the reason why we knew it from the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq was a number of factors. One of the nicest reasons is because we started to look, right? We started to look. Because unlike other conditions, such as you develop a cough or you have a sore ankle, those are things that take you to medical care. Brain injury, because your brain is addled, you just may not know that you have a brain injury. Not unlike mental health. Not unlike mental health. I mean, if you actually have a mental health issue, you just may not know it. Others typically identify it before you do, because you're you. So it's finally when we decided that we're going to say, geez, we're going to go intentionally look for it, and that's when you start to uncover this problem. But I mean, seriously, it didn't exist in sports. Come on, Wayne. I mean, look at us.
I remember.
I mean, you played sports. Did you have your bell rung?
I played football in grade school.
Right.
Exactly.
And every one of us.
Basketball and other things. Yeah.
And you've had your bell rung.
You bet.
Skiing. Absolutely. If you ski, if you play soccer, anybody who's played a sport, I don't care what sport it is, golf. I mean, they're at some point. They know somebody who had their bell rung. And that's a traumatic brain injury. And it's never been counted and all this. So so I said the happy news is we started to look for it. The unfortunate news is that once we started looking for it, we found that it was actually very, very prevalent, right? And but you know what? That's a good thing. Because it allows us now to recognize that there's a condition that we all need to treat. We need to get serious about it. And the sad part was a number of our service members were getting it, both in garrison, by the way, as well as in the war theater. It's the war theater where we first identified it, but now we found that the majority of TBIs across the military in fact occurs in garrison.
Yeah, not in an actual combat situation.
Exactly. And it could come from things that we don't even think about, such as being too close to a mortar tube when they're starting to launch those things out because of the shock wave coming out of the mortar rounds. And so identification is first the most important thing. And look at the secondary benefits. Now, Major League Sports has identified that this is an issue and that require brain injury experts to be on the sideline. I think parents are now becoming aware that this sort of thing happens. And if you think about the training that your grade school coach gave you in football, some of those practices, I would bet you'd be mortified if that was happening today for other children. And this is a good thing. We're getting safer and we're getting better about it.
So this isn't unlike other public health areas where when we didn't know, for example, cholesterol was a problem. We didn't know hypertension, it was an invisible drain. Cigarette smoke, we didn't know they were problems. So this is really sort of unveiling by shining a light on these areas to realize what their connection is with human suffering and the flip side, human flourishing. It can also be preventative, and this knowledge can it? Yeah.
Exactly, and the only thing that we are in right now is there is a little bit of hysteria. I think that traumatic brain injury is very, very prevalent, but fortunately, humans have survived these many millennia, right? And this is without even knowing that there's traumatic brain injury. So yes, we have to identify, but we shouldn't have hysteria around it. I mean, we wouldn't have made it this far if it was each event was a life-threatening event. And there's a certain amount of resilience that humans have relevant to traumatic brain injury. So, but be that as it may, now there's a big focus on it. There's a lot of research that kind of goes around it. There's an understanding that the brain is, in fact, a very important part of us that we need to preserve. And you also mentioned PTS, post-traumatic stress, and some of these other things. These are all part of that discussion. And I think that so long as there's a nexus that brings it all together, that we can discuss it, and then the scientists can start to look for optimal ways to both prevent, diagnose, and treat it, and then the clinicians can also start to institute these things. This is all good.
Right. I know some of our listeners will want to know what some of the discoveries are. DARPA has this reputation of being so far out in the future, almost science fiction-like, that it doesn't have the application ability, and yet what you're saying is that you have been trying to link the application, the translational component to these, really sort of frontier types of areas. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work in there? I know they'd like to hear about some
Sure.
of
So
that.
for traumatic brain injury, DARPA always looks for the place that we believe is an area of opportunity as an agency. We're not a big agency. We've done a lot of things in the past. The history of the agency is rich. But if you actually look at it, the budget is less than a tenth of NIH's, less than a third of National Science Foundation. So it's it's not even a percentage or part of a percentage of the entire Department of Defense. So it really is a small agency. So because of that, we have to be fairly careful on how we pick our investments. So we try to find areas of opportunity. So in this space, the area of opportunity that we believed was available right around the mid-2000 was blast-related traumatic brain injury. So we understand that there's concussive brain injury, such as when you hit your head against the windscreen of your car when it crashes, or if you're playing football, you get bonked in the head. That's a concussive injury. And we know that about penetrating injury. You get shot in the head, all right? So that's a penetrating injury. But blast was brand new. This was the days of the improvised explosive devices, the IEDs, that the insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan were using against our service members. The question, a question was, can the blast wave itself lead to an injury? And so that was thought to be an opportunity space for DARPA. And there wasn't a lot of investment in there. It was an interesting question, and it was a highly relevant question for our service members. So we said, okay, let's start a program looking at that. And it was called PREVENT, Preventing Violent Explosive Neurotrauma, PREVENT. And we brought together a number of very, very eminent scientists from around the country, from Yale University, from the University of Pittsburgh, from Johns Hopkins, from Uniformed Services, and of course Walter Reed Institute, Army Institute of Research. And we kind of brought them together and said, this is our problem area. We want to explore this area. And so, and asked a very simple question, can the shock wave coming out of an explosion be of sufficient intensity that it can lead to a brain injury without throwing a piece of metal into the person or throwing them off their feet and then they landing on their head? I mean, just the shock wave itself. And the long story short goes, after much really disciplined research, they said it can. It can. The shock wave actually can. That opened an opportunity space to say, okay, what then are some of the mechanisms and so on and so forth. So the scientists then grabbed hold of that and now are looking at mechanisms of force coupling in the brain and so on and so forth, and the effect on neurons, which is the brain thinking cells and so forth. But what about the connection to the patient, right? At that point, we recognize that the shock wave is very complex. There's a lot of things coming out of it. There's a pressure wave coming out of it. There's some acceleration coming out of it. All sorts of stuff. And we believe that the pressure wave is the primary driver of this, right? Less so whipping of the head as you would have an acceleration thing like in motor vehicles. But you couldn't say no to that. So before we got into that, we said, but with this information that we have, it's good enough that we have this information. Can we do something for patients, right? Can we, at least let's do something for patients while we're trying to figure it out. And that's when a colleague of mine at DARPA, Jeff Rogers, said, yes, there is. Why don't we just build a simple sensor? Build a simple sensor that can measure that shock wave. And if it's of sufficient intensity, it lights up. It gives you a red light. And that red light says, oh, you, sir, you, ma'am, have been exposed to a shock wave that could be injurious, and we need to do something about it. Versus somebody else who has a green light and said, yes, you heard a big boom, but you were not.
Didn't impact you.
Didn't impact you. That has practical relevance, especially in a wartime environment.
Sure.
So Jeff went ahead, created a program, worked with a remarkable scientist, parallel set of scientists. They built this little widget. This widget was literally less than 20 grams. I mean, the doggone thing, you could hold it in one finger, and you could hang it on your helmet. You can hang it on your jacket, whatever. And the point is that if you are in a blast environment, the service members, the medic could run up and look at your little indicator and said, is it red or is it green? Or even yellow, and said, oh, it is green, you're fine, don't worry about it, you're good to go. It's red, and the service members say, I feel fine.
Right.
So, nope. This is the point of going forward and looking. Right. You don't realize that you're at risk. It's like high blood pressure.
Right.
I feel fine, but your systolic blood pressure is 180, right? So the whole idea is that red light allowed the service member to say, no, the medic's going to pull you off the line,
back.
let you rest a little bit, let you recover a little bit, but you've been exposed, and thereby it doesn't exacerbate or make worse the situation.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, was a classic example of a research project that led to a practical product that had patient relevance.
Right. That would lead to the ability to perform better, not only individually as a patient, but even collectively as a group.
Exactly.
In those areas, right? Because if you have someone who's compromised, who's in there functioning, not knowing they're compromised, that compromises the entire group's function. So whatever their mission is.
Wayne, I think that is
areas.
actually a critical element. Most people think only of the individual, and you're exactly right. It's the group. It's not unlike in football or sports. You can imagine if the quarterback is knocked down, had a little bit of a concussion, they let him play, and then you find out everybody else is fine, but all of a sudden the next several plays go awry because they didn't take this guy out.
Exactly.
You know, and then they brought in the backup quarterback, who may not be as wonderful as the primary quarterback, but he's certainly better than the primary quarterback who's been addled in the head.
Exactly.
Right? And so, you're exactly in a wartime environment, let's pretend it was your radio operator who's addled.
Right.
And now you're not even getting good messaging. So there are a lot of consequences. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. So that's an example of something coming into the brain to detect, but you've also worked on stuff coming out of the brain to help people utilize brain function to sort of optimize its ability to actually have us function. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. In fact, I would even say it's actually opening an incredible new frontier for us. So, to give credit, this was a program that was started by Dr. Alan Rudolph and Dr. Eric Eisenstadt back when they were DARPA programmers, and they asked a very simple question. They said, geez, I wonder if we are technologically at that stage where we can actually measure brain signals and understand what those signals might be. And a lot of people say, oh, that's like reading minds. And no, not exactly. What those two program managers were referring to was, can you measure the electrical activity of the brain that, let's say, runs your arm or your leg, does actually a motor function, and can you understand enough that you can actually use that information to run an external device? That was a really simple question. So they funded a number of folks. One in particular is Miguel Nicoleas down at Duke University, as well as a number of other really eminent scientists, neuroscientists, and they found that that actually the brain, when it fires electrical signals to go down to the hand, go down to the feet, it's actually a code of sorts, right? I mean, there's a very unique electrical signature that says, oh, pick your arm up, oh, open your fingers, oh, close your hand, oh, step forward, step back, this sort of thing. And although these unique codes, there's a lot of them, because you move your hands and your arms and your fingers, myriad of things, it's still a finite number. So when you hook it up to a computer that can download all this thing and decode it, you actually can read the script of the brain, which is really kind of neat.
Yeah.
And so they showed that they could do this. And at this point, I joined the agency, and together, collectively, we thought, my gosh, what can you do with this? The obvious thing that you can do with this is, again, take it to patients. We now recognize that, oh my goodness gracious, if we can read some of the signals of the brain that say, oh, move your arm, move your leg, wiggle your ears, can we use that in a beneficent way? And the answer is absolutely. And the most obvious place, and the one we started at, was someone who's lost their arm. Losing your arm is a very a debilitating condition, because you've lost your hand, and your hand is really how you interact with your environment. I mean, you think about your hand. You know, that's how you turn on a key. That's how you write on with a pencil. That's how you work on a typewriter, and on it goes. To lose that whole limb is really very debilitating. Yeah. And in fact, the only thing that doctors can give now is a hook. But that's the best that you can get. So if we could really decode these messages, could we get someone to actually really run a robot arm with a robot hand? And you say, well, robot hands don't exist right now. They don't, because what use are they? But if you put the two together, now you've got something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we created this program where we would build a robot arm and a robot hand with 5 fingers and a thumb on a ball joint, and on it goes. And at the same time, so those are engineers, and then we bring in the world of neuroscientists who say, okay, I'm going to work on decoding the brain signals that say, oh, I'm going to open and close my hand and move my elbow and all that, and I'm going to marry the two together, and then we could come up with a brain-controlled robot arm, kind of like, if you want to imagine it, what Luke Skywalker in Star Wars got after he got hurt, or Detective Dell Spooner got in the movie iROBOT when he had a replacement arm and hand. Conceptually, that was our goal. And after much work, I'm happy to say, is we succeeded.
Really?
And we actually had patients, not just one, but patients, with a small itty-bitty chip about the size of your pinky nail, laying on the surface of their brain, measuring the brain signals, and those signals go to a computer, and that computer then says, oh, he is thinking or she is thinking, we have men and women in this, picking the arm up, putting the arm down, opening the hand, closing the hand, and hooked up to a robot arm, and in fact, they're able to think and run that arm.
Wow.
And so we're already at that point where folks at this point who are like Mr. Christopher Reeve had with the spinal cord, can move his arms or legs at all, now actually have working arms and hands that they can use to comb their hair, brush their teeth, feed themselves, this sort of thing. You can imagine how enabling that is. And our goal ultimately is to have it for anybody who has does no longer has the functional arm, that they will actually have a fully replaceable arm. But one of the things that we noticed as we were going through this process, we realized that it was, yes, this is truly medicine, where we're able to help enable a patient to go ahead and use these robotic arms to basically have restoration of function. But let's step back a minute and let's take a look at it from even a higher level. What are we really doing? What we're really doing is having a human think about using a tool. The tool happens to be their arm and their hands, of course, but it's a tool nevertheless. And now what we've done is the tool now is, instead of being their natural arm and hand, their natural tool, right, they're now using a robot tool.
Right.
Well, it's the brain controlling the tool directly. So it opens the possibility of, can you control other tools directly with your brain? Right. And in fact, what we did...
Besides your arm and hand, so any kind of tool. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And so we did a step further, and we actually, one of these patients, Jan, up at the University of Pittsburgh, who does control the robot arm and hand, she does it beautifully, we hooked her directly up to an airplane flight simulator. And she never had a flying lesson in her life. And we said, when you are hooked in this flight simulator, we want you to do is think about moving a joystick back to climb, down to go forward, left to bank left, and right to bank right. And so she started thinking about it that way, and she was able to fly this flight simulator immediately. Not the flight lesson in her life. She achieved level flight immediately. But even better, very rapidly, within the same training session, that's how rapidly, she learned not to think about moving her hand anymore, but thinking about moving the aircraft.
With her mind.
With her mind. That I'm going to bank right, I'm going to bank left, I'm going to climb, I'm going to dive. And the plane did that. And so she was so good during that training session. This is only an hour-long training session. Instead of just getting level flight, she flew through a canyon and flew through, and then went up and down and around a canyon. So good was her training session, at the next training session, we actually had her fly a jet fighter, the most complicated aircraft known to man right now. And it takes, forget the amount of time it takes to learn how to fly those things. And immediately, because she was thinking about, I am the airplane.
Right.
The way you think about moving your arms and your fingers, she's thinking about how I'm going to fly this aircraft. Right. Boom! She flew. She landed it. She took off. She dove. She climbed. All this stuff in a high performance jet aircraft fighter. And so you realize that the opportunity space for how we, as normal, regular, able-bodied human beings, can interact with our environment, then the kind of tools that can be created for us to be able to do the things we want to do, we're opening a brand new world. And remember, this is the agency that invented the internet. Right. And back then, who knew what the internet would become? And the internet is now, I would say, is a necessity for most of us. But back then, and many of us were alive, you and I were alive certainly, Wayne, back when the internet was first being introduced, which was in the early 70s. Who knew that it would become what it is? Even we would not know what it had become. So what about this incredible dimension where humans now can control devices directly by thought? It's, I think it's extraordinary. I think the opportunity space is just that. And it's all about, remember how we started. Right. Technology, neuroscience coming together, improve the human condition, but then in doing so, opening up a vast opportunity space for everybody.
This is amazing. This is like, by bypassing some of these, this is like flying in your dreams, isn't it? I mean, it's using your mind to actually sort of merge with the jet in this case.
But think about how you drive your car now.
Sure.
You don't think about, I'm grabbing the steering, I'm turning left, I'm turning right. I mean, you basically you basically your car basically allows you to move at 60 miles an hour, and it's no different than if you were running at 60 miles an hour.
Right.
It's just you're working this car.
Right.
Initially, yes, it was cumbersome, but ultimately it became part of you.
Yeah, well, in some ways, by bypassing some of the tools that we currently rely on, we could actually improve on the performance, is what you're saying.
Oh, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, we're planning on having Vint Cerf come in and talk about the whole internet. He was one of the inventors of the internet, and just to tap his brain about, did he imagine how it would be used, in these areas? So this is an example of that. So where are we going here? Yesterday, on the front page of the New York Times, there's a young girl who was dying of cancer, and she had her brain frozen because the thought was that with the new advances in neuroscience, with the President's Brain Initiative mapping all these connections, that we might be able to sort of replicate a personality, a person in that area. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot on these areas, but is that something? Are we moving in that direction? Are we going to be able to understand the functions of the brain sufficiently to say that the more subjective components of our experience are something that we can now tap into, control, interface, and understand using science?
So we're a long way away from that. So let me be very clear here. So the things that we were talking about was understand the brain, be able to do things, right? And that's very simplistic in the overall scheme of things in terms of what the brain is capable of. The brain actually works at a capacity that far exceeds any of our in silico computers. I mean, we're talking, the brain works at terabytes per millisecond, really, whereas computers are still at terabytes per second, if not multiple seconds, right? And so we're many orders of magnitude away from what just a single human brain does. And you look at the connectivity, in silico connectivity of computers, it's extraordinary, but look at the connectivity of a human neuron, with all the synapsing, all the synaptic buttons along it. The interconnectivity of the human brain is extraordinary. And the human brain does one other thing too. It adapts on the fly. When you learn, you're adapting on the fly. When you get injured and you remap yourself, you're at that. We call plasticity. Computers don't have that right now. Could the computer ever get to that point? And we're talking about artificial intelligence, really. Man, I suppose that it is possible, because anything is possible. When will that happen? I can't speak to that. From my understanding of where the computer science of artificial intelligence is today, we're still a long ways off. There needs to be some extraordinary breakthroughs. I mean, there might need to be a Newton to come along to help. A 21st century Newton or a 21st century Einstein or a 21st century Turing to come along and come up with a great idea to move it forward. But could you imagine that could happen? The answer is yes. And there's a lot of fear about that, and I think that's a little misplaced, because a lot of folks are concerned that we'll abdicate all of our functions over to a computer, kind of like the way we're abdicating a lot of our more rudimentary things to a computer, such as a factory working, right? I mean, just you see the computers building cars, for example. But what they've done is they've taken away the most dreary of the human experiences and allowed humans to do other things. And I believe that that's what's going to happen. I mean, if you imagine this. If you had a computer that you could be symbiotic with, if this computer had a certain amount of intelligence, and you, of course, have your intelligence, and things that the humans are really good at are seeing irregularities, thinking abstractly, this sort of thing. Computers are very logical, right? So it's our illogic with their logic together. You can imagine how good it'd be. I say, like, for example, wouldn't it be cool to be able to talk to Newton if he had a laptop and Google at his disposal? Right. I mean, wouldn't that be like totally wild what Sir Isaac Newton could have done with that? Right. Or Einstein, right? I mean, holy smokes. So I'm thinking, imagine the same thing, you or me in symbiosis with a in silico computer that has some level of AI. Together, we would be much better than that computer alone. Together, we would be much better than ourselves alone. So I don't see why we would ever abdicate everything to these computers so that we'd be passive. I mean, that's just not in the human nature. We're always going to try to think the next step up, but we're being symbiotic with them. So what does that mean? Does it mean that we need to freeze our brains, going back to where you are, to be part of this? Well, I mean, you could, and in the hopes that in the defrosting of the brain that somebody didn't muck it up and that you'll still be there. That's a thought. right now organ preservation is a completely different discussion, but there may be a time where death as we know it may not be the experience as we talk about. I mean, the failures of our body right now. For example, let's go back to the robot arm. If your arms and your legs fail, in a very near future, you could get replacement robot arms and legs. What about the rest of your body, you might ask, that could at least support your brain and then you're able to go. That I believe that in the short term, in the next 10, 20 years, we'll have certain exoskeletons, not full robots, but exoskeletons that will actually improve things for the elderly, that they'll be able to walk now where they can't, and they can play tennis where they can't, they can dance where they can't. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
These are technologies that sit around their body that assist them.
Exactly.
To help them function, walk and move.
Right, and it's controlled by thought, controlled a little bit by local, but those things are very close. Those things are not far away, and I think I'm hoping they'll go a little faster because I'm getting kind of old myself. So, right. but these things are really within our grasp, and we'll learn how to work with them is what I'm getting at. So by the time we get up to this AI-based in silico computer that has the power to be symbiotic with us, we will have learned much along that journey. It's not going to be a shock to us that it's going to show up tomorrow and then we have to figure it out, or come from outer space and plunk, there it is, figure it out. It's not. It's going to be a very gradual process as you build forward to it. Industrialization, automobiles, all those things. If we drop them on, if we took a car right now and dropped it onto 11th century medieval England and said, here you go, I mean, people would totally freak out. But people didn't freak out because it was a gradual process that got us in. And I believe it's the same thing here. So I don't fear that. But the question of what does it mean to be in terms of our consciousness and being able to survive beyond the death of our bodies, it's an interesting thought, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Look forward to further discussions on that. And of course, Ray Kurzweil and others have been talking about this for a long time in those areas, and we'll have them on this show too at some point. Let me flip this though a little bit and ask about the non-tech side. The subjective components are some of the things that humans value the most: love, compassion, social relationships, in addition to sort of moral decisions in terms of how do we make sure that justice and the public benefit occurs at sort of the maximum numbers. And I've always wondered, and I think you're the perfect person to ask this because of your commitment to the social components, to the patient, for example. Is technology, do we risk technology getting us so fascinated by the future and by the possibilities that we tend to neglect the core sort of public health issues that we could solve today if we turned our lens a little bit, using technology perhaps, to really solve some of the problems of poverty, of the disparities in healthcare that are occurring. We had Steve Wolf that described how the U.S.'s healthcare system is beginning to lose its value in terms of its ability to create health compared to the amount of investment in this area. Is technology part of the problem in terms of distracting that? And if so, can we sort of return, is there a way to return that lens back to public health benefit?
Well, actually, I don't believe that technology has been negative. I believe it's been incredibly positive for all the things of which you speak. All the things of which you speak. Because what technology does is it allows us to think about what is possible, what we aspire to. What do we aspire to? Not what we can do, not what's possible, but actually what is our aspiration? If our aspiration is a just society, if our aspiration is to be able to be compassionate to our fellow man, to be able to provide those areas that for which resources are lacking, parts of this world have always been left behind. I believe that technology allows us that opportunity to actually bring that. So let's take something closer to home. Last year, Ebola broke out in Liberia. We all heard about it. It was tragic, right? It broke out, and it was starting to work its way through Liberia. It was working its way through Western Africa. Right. And honestly, technology allowed us to intercede. We were able to first of all, we were able to galvanize world opinion. how else are you going to galvanize world opinion? Seriously, I mean, think about the 18th century, think about the 19th century, the 1800s. The area of industrial revolution. There's no way you're going to galvanize world opinion. World opinion was galvanized. So because of technology, being able to get the message out, as it were. The second thing is that we were then able to put into place response teams. We were able to fly them over there. We were able to set up labs out there. I mean, they were doing PCR. I mean, for goodness sakes, PCR? And then some of the remarkable first providers that were out there, from the
PCR is something for our listeners. Positively identifies exactly where the virus is, what it is, and where it's spreading, this type of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is always a question of how you use that technology and who decides, right? The more we democratize this, the better it is, right? The better it is. If we leave it in the hands of just a few super wealthy or super powerful, that is bad. That is because we're really hoping for beneficence at that level. As they always say, a benign monarch is the most efficient form of government. All right. Yeah. How many of those are there?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
So.
And how long do they last?
Right. Because I always think about this other one, which is absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. So let's go back to democratizing it means that everybody knows about it. Everybody has an obvious opportunity to have input into it. Technology allows us to do that. The cell phone is one of the most incredible democratizing pieces of equipment that we have because we're actually able to do this. The second thing is, where's our moral compass? Where does it come from? Who drives it? And we like to say, other parts of time were more moral. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, you think about it. The Bible says slavery is okay, right? Slavery was fine in the New World, up until 1865 or 1864, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, for goodness sakes. I mean, then it was fine. So the moral compass, as we give even the playing field through education, through information opportunity spaces, on it goes, things like slavery, I mean, which is a classic example, becomes more and more abhorrent to all of us, as it ought to be, right? And so, and that's the only way that I think that we're going to be able to extend that. Now, the question of what is the moral compass, what in fact are the definitions of right and wrong, they evolve, and they're going to constantly evolve, and I'm hoping they evolve in a better way. I mean, right now, for example, things like sexuality, things about gender bias, these things are being challenged, finally. Good. Parts of the world, they're not challenged at all. But as you educate them, as you give more information, those areas of the world are starting to challenge them, where traditionally they would have been unthinkable to challenge things like gender bias, right? And now it is being challenged, and this is a good thing. So our moral compass, I believe, is actually getting stronger, Wayne. Right. But we have to constantly have it so that there's a democratization of the time. It can't be so expensive that people can't have it. Yeah. It can't be so difficult that they can't use it. And it can't be guarded as a state secret so that we don't even get it out. Right. And so there has to be a certain openness of it. And I think that as long as we try to maintain that, we'll be okay.
Yeah. What an amazing thought if you could embed sort of a solid moral compass with the technology into a democratization process to spread it and make it a core part. It would be a tremendous aspect. We talked earlier about, well, what if Newton or Einstein had the power of technology that we have today? And it makes me think, well, what if Gandhi had that? I watched the movie again, Gandhi, around that, and what a moral force he had. But what if he had the technology to be able to actually embed that in a democratization process and make it available for all people at a rapid and instant pace? I mean, the whole issue of mitigating violence and racism and that type of thing could potentially be vastly accelerated, couldn't it?
That's a great example. I mean, Gandhi, his own presence inspired others. Yeah. By his example. I mean, when you look at his writings, they had tremendous impact. But it was actually his actions that spoke so loudly, right? And his passive resistant movement, for example. If everybody could see that, if everybody could experience that, that would be an extraordinary thing. Because and technology might allow that. You might not physically be in Delhi at the time, but if you were able to experience that, even remotely, it has to be impactful. Or to hear Martin Luther King's speeches, it has to be impactful, right? And in fact, Martin Luther King's speeches were good because remember he was, Gandhi was prior to World War II. Martin Luther King was in the '60s. He had television, he had radio, and he inspired a nation. He inspired a nation. But without technology, he would have inspired only those who could hear him. And as we start to do more and more with online access and so on and so forth, I agree with you. It still comes down to we as a people still have to decide where is our moral compass, and then we could have these very open discussions, open dialogue, and start to come to it because everybody has a different opinion.
So it sounds like the world would benefit from further development and further discussion around how do we embed sort of the highest moral aspirations into the world using technology, and how can technology be used to actually guide that moral compass in those areas. Well, that's on that lovely thought. I want to thank you so much for coming in and allowing me to interview you, allow us to talk. I mean, it's a fascinating conversation, and I really makes me encouraged. I mean, that folks in DARPA are thinking about these types of things, and so I'll look for a chaplain to get assigned to DARPA next along the last thought. But I think the Samueli Institute we'd certainly be interested here in hosting a meeting where some of these things were discussed in those areas. I know I did have discussions with Singularity University around, are there ways we could use technology to accelerate the reduction of racism, for example, and they're very interested in that. So I think that needs to be done more. So thank you so much for everything that you've done in both the service to the country, the service to the patient, and our healthcare system, to science, and looking forward to much more together in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Mrs. Patty Shinseki will join us on the next episode of On Human Flourishing. Mr. Shinseki is married to General Eric Shinseki, the former U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and has a long history of philanthropic work supporting members of the military and their families.
You know, military children are unique in that not only are they growing up in an environment that other children grow up in, they also face relocations. They also face deployments or long separations. And like you in a foreign country, you are living the foreign policy of our nation unknowingly. You know, so they live the foreign policy when they're overseas. And they become little ambassadors in many ways.
Please join us on Monday, November 9th for that discussion.